You see, the trouble with anything powerful, be it a jet aircraft, a rifle, or a psychedelic, is not that it exists, but that we don't know how to treat it with respect. Our so-called civilized society, ever trembling before what it does not understand, reacts to such things with prohibition and paranoia. We are, in short, frightened of our own minds. Psychedelic substances, LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, are not narcotics. They do not lull one into sleep or torpor. Quite the contrary. They wake you up. They open your senses so completely that the very texture of a fungus-covered log can appear as if carved by Cellini. You see light as music, music as texture, and the veil between the senses is momentarily torn. And in that tearing, something astonishing happens. But alas, the authorities still operate under the delusion that suppression equals control. They have not learned the simplest lesson of prohibition. That which is forbidden becomes a lure. And so, in their efforts to keep the door shut, they have made it irresistible. Yet behind that door lies not fantasy, not madness, but the possibility of encountering consciousness itself pure, unfiltered, and terrifyingly vast. The problem is not the substance, the problem is us. We have no priesthood fit for the task, no figure who is simultaneously pharmacologist, mythologist, theologian, and lover of mystery. And so the question arises, who shall guide us through the jungle of the mind? Because whether we like it or not, people will go in. The only question that remains is whether they will go in alone and blind, or with a light in their hand and a voice beside them saying, look at what you are. Let us begin then by laying out the characters on the stage for each of these substances has its own personality, its own quality of vision, its own voice, and they are not, you see, interchangeable. There is the mushroom, Psilocybe mexicana haim, known by those who revere it as Teonanacatl, flesh of God, found in Oaxaca, scattered along the western coast of the Americas. This little brown fungi is taken in sacrament, not for amusement. It does not shout, it hums, it sings the music of roots and rainfall and soil. It connects one not to the sky, but to the earth, so that you feel yourself not standing on the ground, but of it. The vision here is vegetal leaves shimmer, the wind reveals its patterns, and even the stones seem to breathe with an intelligence you had previously overlooked. Mescaline, the active ingredient in peyote, is of similar earthiness, but it lends the world a kind of luminous intricacy, as if everything had been finely etched by divine craftsmanship. I once picked up a rotting log, thick with fungus, and was struck not by decay but by its elegance. It was as though Cellini himself had carved it into ebony and ivory. Then there is LSD, born not of cactus or mushroom, but of the laboratory, yet no less magical. It arises from ergot, a parasitic growth on wheat, and through an alchemical refinement of lysergic acid diethylamide specifically, number 25, we arrive at that most precise of molecular instruments. LSD does not whisper like the mushroom, it glows. It pulses with an electronic brilliance, as if your mind had been tuned to the frequency of circuitry itself. And while its gifts can be extraordinary, they arrive with a certain exacting energy, a sense of glass and geometry, rather than moss and bark. Each substance, you see, carries you into a different chamber of the cathedral, and to each door a different key. For one must not forget that these are power tools, not toys, and the measure of their power is hidden in their subtlety. 100 micrograms of LSD, that is 1/10,000th of a gram, will set most minds alight. A dose too large, and it is not enlightenment you experience, but turbulence. Now imagine then the reckless absurdity of those who vie with one another, boasting of how much they've taken. 1,000 micrograms, they say, as if such madness were heroic. That, my friends, is like attempting to land a jet on the village green. It is idiocy, not bravery. There is a curious tendency among human beings, particularly in youth, to mistake power for virtue. But the wisdom of these substances lies not in how far they take you, but in how clearly you can see where you are. What is the use of a rocket ship if the pilot is blind? So I suggest this. These are not drugs in the common sense. They are instruments more like pianos or microscopes than syringes. And like any instrument of precision, they require skill, reverence, and restraint. And here again we face the great conundrum. Who is fit to guide us? The psychiatrist may know the anatomy of the brain, but little of mythology. The priest may speak of God, but nothing of biochemistry. And the pharmacologist, though clever with molecules, is deaf to music. We have not, you see, created a class of human being who is competent in all these arts. And so, in the vacuum of qualified guidance, society falls back on the only tool it trusts, the club of prohibition. But you cannot club a vision out of existence. You cannot arrest a question. And these chemicals are questions in crystalline form. They ask not, what do you believe, but what is belief? Not, what do you see, but who is doing the seeing? And if those questions are dangerous, then so be it. They are dangerous in the way fire is dangerous necessary for transformation, but foolish to leave unattended. So let us be clear. The danger does not lie in the molecule. It lies in our unpreparedness to meet what it reveals. A mirror is only terrifying to a man who does not know his own face. Now this, you see, is where the predicament becomes positively labyrinthine. For in all matters of spiritual or psychological depth, we long for a guide someone to say, this way, not that. Yet with psychedelics, the path is not marked. There are no roads and sudden clearings in the forest of the mind. And so we are left with the awkward question, who is qualified? The psychiatrist, clever with diagnosis and armed with impressive terminology, may know the contours of the mind, but has likely never stood in awe before the eternal. The priest may speak of God's mysteries, but usually from the safety of doctrine. The pharmacologist, meticulous in his measurements, may understand the chemical but not the vision. What is needed is something we have not yet trained, a new kind of human being, one who is at once scientist and mystic, physician and poet, one who is not afraid to speak in the language of myth and yet knows precisely the measurements of the molecule. But such people are rare, and without them we get a kind of cultural schizophrenia. On the one hand, spiritual yearning, on the other, legal suppression, and in between, silence. So, what happens? Well, the exploration goes underground. A group of students, earnest, not out for so-called kicks, but seeking insight, might wish to take LSD in the presence of a calm and learned psychiatrist. Not to escape life, but to enter it more deeply. Yet the law says no. It would be illegal for such a doctor to participate. And thus the absurdity, the very conditions under which the experience could be most safe and fruitful, are forbidden, and into that vacuum steps crime, organized or disorganized, idealistic or greedy. Molecules move from hand to hand like contraband treasure, but without the ritual, without the preparation, without the why. And so the vision loses its center and becomes spectacle. That is where the danger lies, not in the substance, but in its exile. Once the curtain is drawn back, then we enter what I might call sensory jazz. The ordinary world begins to breathe. Walls ripple as if woven of cloth. The pile of a carpet becomes a writhing jungle of threads, and the sounds, good Lord, the sounds, they do not simply strike the ear, they pass through you like wind through a harp. This is no hallucination in the psychiatric sense, for one does not mistake these visions for objects in the public shared world. One knows full well that the world is not made of rubber and lace, but something in it shimmers. One might look at a sea urchin shell, and suddenly every spine begins to wiggle, not randomly, but in exquisite coordination. A breathing pulse in geometry. Is it the shell, the eye, or the mind that makes it dance, what you begin to realize is something quite unnerving, that perception itself is active, not passive, that your eyes do not simply receive, they compose, and your ears sculpt the music they seem merely to detect. The senses are not windows. They are instruments, each one a tuning fork to the symphony of existence. And then, the great reveal, all the senses are one. You touch light with your eyes. You feel music with your skin. You smell time. You see silence. This is not poetry, it is direct experience. The boundaries between senses collapse, revealing a single, unified field of awareness, as if your consciousness were not a bundle of inputs, but a single humming flame. And in this flame, the familiar becomes strange, the ordinary becomes sacred, and the world you thought you knew reveals itself to be, well, not false but unfixed, not illusion but illusion-shaped. It is not that the world is wrong, it is simply that you were asleep in it. And now, for a moment, the veil has slipped. Now, here is where the whole show begins to turn inside out. For under the influence of these sacraments, one discovers something deeply unsettling to the ordinary mind, that opposites are not opposed. They are related, and not merely related, but interdependent. They imply one another. You see, we are trained to think in terms of either or, good or evil, life or death, self or other, but these substances facilitate a curious shift-down, moves from either or to both, and it is not this or that. As inseparable as front and back, up and down, inhale and exhale. Gestalt psychology hints at it. Show someone the silhouette of two faces in profile. What do they see? Two people about to kiss, or a chalice between them? They can see one or the other, but rarely both at once. And yet both are there. The image doesn't change. Only attention does. Likewise, we say a circle drawn on a blackboard is a ball. Rarely do we say it's a hole in a wall, but of course both descriptions are valid. Figure and ground define one another. And so in the psychedelic state, one feels not thinks, but feels that self and world are one system. That the inside goes with the outside as the sound of a bell goes with the hammer that strikes it, and that you do not move through the world like a billiard ball on a table. You arise with it, like a wave upon the sea. But Thano, dear, this realization has a tendency to unnerve. For if good implies evil, if life implies death, if all things are relative, well then, who's in charge? Where is the solid ground? What do I trust? And that, you see, brings us to the edge of the cliff. Now here, my dear friends, is the moment of terror. Because once you see that there is no absolute this or that, no fixed moral compass dropped from heaven, no eternal truth hanging like a chandelier in the sky, you may feel the ground fall away. And you are, quite literally, floating. It is as if all that you once called me, the assurances, the definitions, the expectations, have dissolved. And what remains is nothing. No handrails, no floor, no separate observer watching from behind the eyes. Just the bare, trembling fact of awareness, suspended in space. This is the void, not a black hole, but an infinite openness of vastness without anchor or edge. And it is terrifying. You reach out to beliefs, to identities, to old ideas, and they collapse in your hands like paper lanterns in the rain. And then the panic may arise. Will I stay like this? What will I become? What if I do something terrible? What if I lose myself forever? But if you can just let go, if you can stop clinging to the rock that is falling with you, and simply fall, then something marvelous occurs. The fear melts, and the void, which seemed cold and empty, begins to shine, not with light, as from the sun, but with clarity, a presence that is not a thing, but the absence of all clinging, a letting be. You discover that the void is not the absence of self, it is the truth of self. That you were never a fixed thing to begin with. You were always a process, a pattern, a dance. You are the universe pretending, momentarily, to be a person. And so what seemed like death turns out to be awakening. It is here that the great traditions speak of the clear light, the Tao, the Dharmakaya, the God beyond gods. You may call it what you like, but no name will grasp it. It is not an object of experience, it is experience. Or better, that which knows there is experience. And once this is seen even, for a moment it changes you. Not in the sense of becoming something new, but of remembering something ancient. The game of forgetting is over, if only for a time. You see, the void is not the enemy, it is home. Now we arrive at a most curious and subtle question. What is a vision? Because under the influence of these sacraments, people see things. Yes, of course they do. But the trouble is, our modern minds are so terribly anxious about truth and falsity. Is it real? We ask. Is this a hallucination? Am I imagining this? But let me ask you, what isn't imagined? You see, a hallucination, strictly speaking, is something seen by one and not by others, which is mistaken for an objective thing. But when one sees with the inner eye and knows that what is beheld is a product of mind, it ceases to be a hallucination and becomes a vision. And visions are older than reason, older than science. They are the raw fabric of mythology, of poetry, of revelation. A vision may not be something you can point at with a ruler and say, there it is. But if it moves you, if it changes the very way you see them, what more reality do you want? And with these chemicals, you see, the senses begin to turn inward. In normal life, we see but do not notice seeing. We hear but take no note of the hearing. But here, perception turns upon itself. You become aware of being aware. And this is the beginning of true self-inquiry. Not the self as an object, something to be improved, judged, or corrected, but the self as awareness itself. The light by which all else is seen. At first everything feels a little off. Not wrong, not broken, just strange. As if the world had been gently untuned. But soon you realize that this tuning is not an error, it is an invitation to question, why do I normally see it that way? What is the right way to organize the world? And this is not merely visual. You begin to hear colors, to see sounds. The walls breathe and the breath becomes you. The distinctions between the senses dissolve, and you realize they are all but modes of one fundamental capacity, touch. All seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, feeling, they are all ways of touching the world. And as you touch it, you realize with no doubt that it is touching you back. Eventually, the storm quiets. The veil that had been torn open begins to mend. The dancing patterns still, the colors soften, and the senses begin to settle into their familiar grooves. And you find yourself once more in the everyday. But something has changed. You see, the sacred trick of the whole thing is this. You return to precisely the same world, but now you see it. As if for the first time, the ordinary becomes radiant. You sit with a cup of tea, and it is no longer just tea. It is a miracle in a cup. Light, water, warmth, time all condensed into this simple moment, a whisper from the cosmos saying, you are home. And you begin to realize there never was a separation between the sacred and the mundane, between enlightenment and confusion. The luminous vision and the dull routine were never two different things. One is simply the unmasked face of the other. Relativity, you see, is not a problem. It is the key. Because all things are interrelated, good with evil, light with dark, form with emptiness. This is not moral confusion, it is the fundamental harmony of opposites. Just as opposite petals emerge from the same flower, so too do all extremes arise from the same center. And once this is seen even dimly, you are changed. Not in the way that a caterpillar becomes a butterfly, but more like one who suddenly remembers, "Ah, yes, I knew this long ago." You return, yes, but you are not the same one who left, because now you have seen through the veil. You have played hide and seek with God. And whether you remember the vision clearly or not, the knowing remains, like a seed planted in the soil of the soul. And perhaps one day, in a moment of silence or sorrow or laughter, it will bloom again. One of the greatest confusions in the modern world is this peculiar idea that control means suppression. That to be a controlled person is to be one who denies himself, disciplines his instincts, and walks always in a straight line. But true control, like that of a dancer, is not rigidity. It is grace. You don't control a car by locking it in the garage. You control it by learning how it moves, how it responds, how to dance with its weight and motion. Likewise, to control desire is not to strangle it, but to know it intimately and move with it wisely. Now, when it comes to psychedelics, our so-called authorities have not understood this. Instead of seeking a sane and sacred relationship with these substances, they have chosen the blunt instrument of prohibition. Lock it up, stamp it out, pretend it doesn't exist, as if that ever worked. You cannot forbid curiosity. You cannot outlaw the imagination. And so what happens? The very act of suppression makes these sacraments more alluring. They become symbols of rebellion, of mystery. And into that vacuum rushes the black market filled, not with initiates, but with profiteers and amateurs. The tragedy is not that people are taking these substances. The tragedy is that they are doing so without guidance, without context, and without reverence. Control, in the true sense, would be education, initiation, the cultivation of wise and humble explorers of consciousness, rather than criminalizing their very inquiry. We must come to see that these are not enemies of society. They are simply mirrors, sometimes clear, sometimes distorted, in which we glimpse what lies beneath the mask of the ordinary. To fear that is to fear ourselves. At the heart of all this, you see, is not a chemical, not even an experience. It is a recognition that you are not separate from the world you behold, that the self you've taken as a noun is actually a verb, that what you call I is a process, a happening, a pattern of the universe expressing itself just as a wave is an expression of the ocean. In the depths of the psychedelic state, there may come a moment, a flash, perhaps only a few seconds, where you feel as though you've touched the center of it all, as if for a heartbeat you placed your finger on the very pulse of existence. And what was it? It was light. It was laughter. It was love, not as a sentiment, but as a force. A luminous, boundless, jubilant recognition that this is it. And even as that peak recedes, its echo remains. You see it in the leaves, in the sidewalk cracks, in the curve of a stranger's smile. The world does not go back to normal. Because you have seen what normal really is, this fantastic cosmic hide and seek, where you are, it all along. This, then, is the flowering of consciousness. The recognition that opposites are not enemies but partners. That relativity is not chaos but harmony. That even the darkest petal of experience blooms from the same radiant center. And that you are not a stranger in this universe wandering through an alien landscape. You are the universe waking up to itself through eyes that it made, with breath that it lends, for a time that it names now. So whether you return to the garden or stay a while in the forest of the inner world, remember this: the point was never to escape. The point was to see more deeply, more truly, more whole. And so you come back, not enlightened, but lighter, knowing that the game was never to be won, only to be played beautifully.